I did not expect my quiet lakefront street to turn into a countdown. 1 minute my pickup truck was just sitting under the dim streetlight, grill facing the dark water, metal cooling and popping in the night air. The next, it was a target in a series of grainy late-night photos that would be used to threaten a $500 lien if I did not comply before Monday. The first time I saw those photos, they were printed in color on cheap office paper and stapled to a letter with my lot number at the top. The letter talked about violations and compliance and escalating fines. It referenced Board Parking Rule 5.2 like it was some sacred scripture, and it gave me a deadline, like I was already guilty. That was the moment I realized this was not a misunderstanding. It was a campaign. The woman behind it lived 3 houses down and across the street, in a beige 2-story that looked like every other modern build on our cul-de-sac. She had a position on the HOA board, a permanent scowl, and a habit of standing in her driveway with her phone pointed at my truck. The neighbors called her the compliance queen. In my head, she was the Karen of our lakefront, and my work truck had just become her favorite project. The threat felt simple on paper: fix the issue, pay the fine, and move on. But the more I looked at the timing, the dates, and the way she had collected those photos, the more it felt like something else, an abuse of power dressed up as community protection. I could have rolled over. I could have hidden the truck, sold it, or paid the fine just to keep the peace. Instead, I found myself flipping to Parking Rule 5.2 in the association's governing documents and reading it like a puzzle someone thought I would never bother to solve. Somewhere between the legal phrasing and the footnotes, I noticed the wording that would change everything. The board did not know it yet, but that little clause about how overnight parking violations had to be handled would end up mattering more than any of those late-night photos. And while they were busy building a paper trail against my truck, I was about to start building something else, a quiet plan that did not just stop the $500 lien threat, but shifted who got to wield the rules on our supposedly relaxing street. When I first moved into the neighborhood, the lake was what sold me. Our street curved along the shoreline like a lazy ribbon, houses on one side, docks and small boats on the other. On summer evenings, you could hear screens sliding open and the soft splash of someone dropping a paddleboard into the water. Porch lights reflected on the surface in broken streaks of yellow. The association advertised it as peaceful, low traffic, and family-oriented. The HOA paperwork came in a fat welcome packet the size of a phone book. There were covenants, conditions, and restrictions, plus a glossy "Welcome to the Community" brochure promising that the board existed to protect property values and maintain harmony. I skimmed the rules, signed what I had to, and filed everything in a kitchen drawer. I run a small contracting business, so my pickup truck is pretty much my office on wheels. It is not a rusty beater with giant logos or rattling ladders, just a clean half-ton with a toolbox in the back and a magnet I can peel off when I want it to look more like a regular daily driver. The listing agent assured me that as long as it was in good condition and not some huge commercial rig, nobody would care. For the first few months, that seemed true. Sometimes I parked in my driveway. Other times, especially when my small boat was hooked up to the driveway pad, I parked the truck curbside in front of my own lawn. People walked dogs past it. Kids rode scooters around it. The only comment I ever heard, paraphrased, was that it looked like I kept it in good shape. Then I started noticing her. 3 houses down, at the bend where the street curved tight toward the cul-de-sac, lived a woman I will call Ms. D. She had a perfectly manicured yard, a flag that changed with every minor holiday, and a way of standing on her porch that made you feel judged even if she was technically smiling. She was on the board, and compliance was her favorite word. Everyone knew she watched the security cameras like entertainment. The first sign of trouble came as a slip of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. It was titled "Courtesy Notice" in bold letters, and it quoted something called CCR Section 5.2 Street Parking and Commercial Vehicles. The bottom line said that overnight parking on the street for commercial or work vehicles was prohibited and that repeated violations could result in fines. That slip became my first piece of evidence, even though I did not know I would need evidence yet. I kept it, smoothed it out on my kitchen counter, and clipped it to the front of the HOA binder that had been gathering dust in the drawer. I told myself it was a misunderstanding. The truck was not marked up like a billboard. It was not oversized. Most nights it still slept in my driveway. And I had seen more than one big SUV and a construction van parked overnight at different houses without so much as a courtesy note. Days went by, then weeks. For a while, everything quieted down. But quiet has a way of making certain personalities restless. Eventually, the small things started. The way Ms. D would appear in her front window whenever I pulled in late from a job. The way she'd be coincidentally checking her mail when I was unloading tools from the truck at dusk. According to a few neighbors who hinted around it, she had been on a bit of a personal mission lately, cracking down on what she saw as violations. They described it like the beginning of a Karen neighbor drama, but I still wanted to believe it would blow over. One rainy afternoon, when work was slow and the lake was a gray sheet behind the houses, I finally dragged out the entire HOA binder. Sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee, I flipped through the sections: architecture, landscaping, pets, noise, then parking. That was when I found the page titled Board Parking Rule 5.2, Overnight and Street Parking. The text was dense, full of subsections. But right in the middle, there was a sentence that caught my attention. It allowed owners to temporarily park work vehicles on the street if they were used daily for employment, as long as they were in good repair and did not exceed 72 continuous hours without relocation. It also specified that enforcement had to follow a particular procedure: written notice with a cure period, then a hearing opportunity before fines could be levied. I underlined that sentence and stuck a yellow tab on the edge of the page. At the time, it felt like overkill. Later, it would feel like the board had written their own trap and handed me the map. The first official violation letter arrived about a month after that courtesy notice. It came in a windowed envelope with the association's logo at the top and my name printed cleanly underneath. When I opened it, I found a 2-page document labeled Notice of Violation, and attached to it, several low-light photographs of my truck parked at the curb in front of my lawn. The photos were time-stamped, 11:47 p.m., 1:03 a.m., 4:20 a.m. My truck sat there under the same yellow streetlight in each shot, motionless, while everyone on the street slept. The letter claimed I had violated Parking Rule 5.2 by leaving a work vehicle on the street overnight on multiple occasions. It listed 3 dates across 2 weeks and made it sound like I was staging some long-term encampment. There was something unsettling about those pictures. The angle suggested they had been taken from across the street, maybe from a front window or driveway. The flash reflected off the wet pavement on one of the nights, and in another, you could see the faint glow of the lake behind the row of houses. Knowing someone had stood there in the dark to get those shots made my skin crawl. I flipped to the second page and saw the schedule of fines. First offense, warning. Second offense, $50. Third offense, $100, plus a warning that continued noncompliance could lead to a $500 lien added to my account, subject to collection if still unpaid by a board review date. The dates at the bottom were what got me. They lined up with an upcoming Monday board meeting, and the letter's language made it sound like decisions would be made that day about my pattern of noncompliance. It was not just a warning. It was a subtle countdown. I set the letter next to the binder and went back to Parking Rule 5.2. The rule was very clear about steps. Written notice, cure period, opportunity for a hearing. The letter I had in my hands claimed all of that had happened, in summarized form, but in reality I had received only one courtesy slip and this formal notice. No hearing date. No chance to talk before penalties. That contradiction became my second piece of evidence. I printed a copy of the rule, highlighted the relevant sentence about the hearing requirement, and tucked it behind the violation letter in a growing file. The clock was now tied to that Monday meeting, and if I did nothing, a $500 lien would quietly attach itself to my home because one board member had decided my truck offended her view of the street. What the board did not realize was that the same binder they were quoting from so confidently also laid out how they were supposed to notify me, how long they had to wait, and even how elections and board seats could be challenged if enough owners decided they were tired of abuses like this. I did not buy a place on a lake to live through an HOA nightmare run by a single power-drunk volunteer with a camera and a stack of forms. So while those late-night photos sat in their plastic folder in the association office, I started my own quiet timeline. I wrote down the date of the courtesy notice, the date of the violation letter, the dates printed under those grainy pictures. I noted which nights I had actually parked in the driveway and which nights the truck had been on the street. I took photos of other vehicles that had spent nights on the curb with no violations: a contractor van 2 streets over, an oversized SUV visiting for the weekend, a boat trailer left in front of Ms. D's own house after a neighborhood barbecue. By the time Sunday rolled around and clouds hung low over the lake, that growing folder of evidence sat on my table next to my coffee mug. The top page was the violation letter, the second was my highlighted copy of Parking Rule 5.2, and tucked near the back was an excerpt from a board meeting agenda I had downloaded from the association website. The agenda excerpt was short, but it had a line item labeled Homeowner Account Review, Delinquent or Non-Compliant Accounts. It listed my lot number among several others. That agenda page became my third key prop, proof that they fully intended to treat my supposed violation as a money issue before they even followed their own enforcement steps. Rain rattled against the back windows as I stared at those pages. The street outside was quiet except for the soft hiss of tires from the occasional car turning toward the cul-de-sac. Somewhere down the block, I knew Ms. D was probably checking the weather and wondering if that Monday meeting would be quick or dramatic. What she did not know was that I was done waiting to see how far she would push it. If they wanted a case, I was going to give them one, but not in the way they expected. I had started reading beyond Parking Rule 5.2. Past the enforcement section, there were pages explaining how owners could request hearings, how they could appeal decisions, and, buried deeper, how they could nominate candidates and organize a slate for the next board election. The section on rally rules and nominations seemed irrelevant the first time I saw it. Now, with my name printed on a delinquent account agenda, it read like a different kind of weapons manual. I closed the binder, slid it next to the growing file of letters and printouts, and looked out at my truck. It sat in the driveway that night, rain beating on the hood, reflecting the faint glow from my porch light. They wanted to turn my work truck into a violation and my home into leverage. That was the line for me. And by the time the board sat down on Monday, I was not going to be the only one on the defensive anymore. Monday evening, the lake looked flat and harmless, a sheet of dull silver under a thick ceiling of clouds. Inside the small association meeting room near the front of the subdivision, the air felt different. The fluorescent lights hummed, the folding chairs squeaked, and the long plastic table at the front held a neat stack of papers that already had my lot number on them. I took a seat along the side wall, close enough to watch their faces, far enough that I could see the whole room. A framed aerial photo of the neighborhood hung crooked behind the board, showing our homes curved around the water like a marketing brochure. In that picture, there were no arguments about trucks or fines, just smooth roofs and tidy lawns. The meeting started with the usual formalities. They moved through landscaping updates, dock repairs, and a summary of pool key replacements. When they reached the section labeled Homeowner Account Review, the tone shifted. The board president's voice lowered a little. Papers shuffled. Ms. D straightened in her chair, picking up a folder that I knew held photos of my truck. They did not invite me to speak first. They read out a list of lot numbers, balances, and statuses. When they reached mine, the president summarized a recurring overnight parking violation involving a work vehicle and mentioned photographic evidence and prior notices. It was strange, hearing my situation reduced to a few lines on a meeting outline, as if those late-night photos were just another checkbox. I listened closely. What they described sounded organized, methodical, and fair. But it did not match what I had actually experienced. They referenced multiple courtesy notices I had never received and implied I had refused to respond to letters that had never arrived. My binder, sitting at home with its 3 pieces of evidence, told a different story. I raised my hand, waiting for a pause. When the president finally noticed me, there was a flicker of surprise, as if it had never occurred to them that someone whose account they were reviewing might actually show up. I kept my explanation calm in tone, laying out what I had actually received and when. I mentioned the 1 courtesy slip on my windshield and the single violation letter. I asked, very simply, when the hearing they were required to offer under Parking Rule 5.2 had been scheduled. The board members exchanged looks. The president responded in a measured, almost rehearsed way, explaining that the meeting itself functioned as a review and that I was welcome to submit written comments. He avoided using the word hearing, even though that was the exact word written in the rule I had highlighted. It was a small thing, a single word. But it told me everything I needed to know about how this board interpreted their own obligations. By the time they moved on and voted to proceed with enforcement steps on my lot, I realized this was not a misunderstanding at all. This was a group of volunteers who had gotten used to the idea that nobody read the rules as closely as they did. They counted on people not showing up. They counted on owners being too busy or intimidated to challenge their process. And judging by the rubber stamp approval they gave to my enforcement steps, they fully expected me to pay whatever they decided, grumble a little, and get in line. That assumption was about to make their lives very complicated. 2 days after the meeting, I found a new envelope in my mailbox. The paper inside was heavier, the tone sharper. Across the top, in bold, was the title, Final Notice, Parking Violation and Lien Warning, dated May 12. My lot number and name were centered under the association logo, as if I were being formally introduced to my own punishment. This letter laid out the fines in cold, simple numbers. $50 for the second offense. $100 for the third. Administrative fees. Future fines if the violation continued. And at the bottom, a paragraph explaining that if my balance remained unpaid by a specified date, the board may authorize placement of a lien in the amount of $500 against my property. There it was, the money, crystal clear. It was not a hypothetical anymore. It was an actual countdown to a lien that would sit against my home over some late-night parking photos of a clean truck parked in front of my own lawn. I set the final notice dated May 12 next to the earlier letter and the courtesy slip, then opened the binder again. Parking Rule 5.2 still said what it had always said. Written notice. Cure period. Hearing opportunity. Reasonable attempt to resolve before financial penalties. The board had jumped straight ahead, using the Monday meeting as a shortcut. They had not properly offered a hearing. They had compressed the timeline. They treated the lien as leverage instead of a last resort. That was when the danger clicked in a more personal way. If they were this casual about threatening a $500 lien over ambiguous parking rules, what would happen the next time they decided a roof color was wrong, or a shed was too close to the fence, or a boat trailer sat too long near the dock? This was not just about my truck anymore, it was about what happened when money and power were centralized in the hands of a small, unchecked group. For a small business owner, a lien is not just an annoyance. It shows up when you refinance, when you apply for certain loans, when you try to clean up your credit. It can trigger higher rates and harder questions. I stared at that number, imagining it multiplying with late fees and legal costs, turning a minor parking dispute into one of those stories people tell under the heading of HOA fines gone wrong. I refused to be the easy example that taught everyone else to stay scared. From that point on, I stopped treating this like a one-off problem and started treating it like a full campaign. I bought a 3-ring binder just for this situation, slid plastic sheet protectors into it, and began building my own case in chronological order. Courtesy notice. Violation letter. Final notice dated May 12. Parking Rule 5.2 with highlighted sections. Board meeting agenda excerpt with my lot number listed under account review. Then I went back to the governing documents and found something else. In a different section, buried under the heading Notices and Delivery of Association Communications, there was a reference to something called CCR Section 4.3 Mailbox Rule. It explained when a notice was considered delivered, how it had to be mailed, and how much time owners had to respond before further action was taken. The dates on my letters and the dates of their meetings did not line up with those requirements. The same board that loved citing rule numbers had ignored that one completely. Outside, the weather started warming up. Evenings on the lake came back to life, with people grilling on decks, kids laughing near the shore, and the occasional hum of a boat engine across the water. But every time I walked to my mailbox, I felt the tension tug at me. I started noticing how Miss D moved around the street too. Her daily walks seemed to time themselves with our trash pickup days and with whenever my truck happened to be parked at the curb. Her phone was always in her hand, pointed just slightly outward, ready. Neighbors quietly mentioned that she had raised concerns about preserving the upscale look of the street, hinting at how work vehicles might scare off buyers. It did not matter that my truck was cleaner than half the daily drivers in the subdivision. In her mind, it represented something she did not want to look at when she opened her curtains. That was when the social angle kicked in. It was not enough for the board to threaten my wallet, there was an unspoken threat to my reputation too. The more Ms. D painted this as a case of an owner who refused to comply, the easier it would be for her to convince people that I was the problem, not the process. I realized that if I faced this alone, I would always be framed as the difficult one pushing back against reasonable rules. But if I could prove that the rules were being applied unevenly, and that the board was ignoring its own procedures, then this stopped being just my problem. It became a community issue. So I started paying closer attention to everyone else's parking habits. I took discreet photos of the contractor van that stayed overnight 3 houses past mine, the oversized SUV that routinely parked on the street for days at a time, and the boat trailer that sat in front of Ms. D's place after a long weekend. None of those homes, as far as I could tell, received the kind of formal letters I had. The pattern crystallized. It wasn't about the rule, it was about who certain board members decided to target. Nearly a month after that May 12 notice, another envelope arrived, thinner this time but no less important. It was not a violation. It was the association's quarterly newsletter, folded and stapled in the center. Inside, along with announcements about summer events and reminders about pool rules, there was a short paragraph about parking compliance and the need to report concerns to the board. The wording sounded generic, but there were hints. It warned about repeated disregard for street parking restrictions and mentioned work-related vehicles altering the visual character of the community. It suggested that continued non-compliance might force the board to take stronger actions, up to and including liens. I did not need them to print my name for everyone to know who they meant. On our small street, with one visible work truck and one board member who liked to talk, it was clear enough. It felt like a public nudge, a way to remind everyone that they were watching and that someone was being made into an example. It also felt like a misstep, because it framed parking enforcement as serious and ongoing, which meant any inconsistency in how they handled violations suddenly mattered more. I slid the newsletter into my binder behind the final notice dated May 12. My file was starting to look like something more than just a stack of complaints. It looked like a timeline of selective enforcement wrapped in official letterhead. By this point, my work truck had gone from ordinary daily driver to the center of an enforcement campaign. A board member had pushed violation letters, fines, and a looming lien while ignoring their own hearing rules and mailbox timelines, and I had quietly built a detailed binder of every slip, notice, agenda, and newsletter that proved it. The more I studied the documents, the more one section kept pulling at my attention, the part about board composition, election procedures, and nomination deadlines. I had gone into the binder looking for ways to protect myself from one lien. Instead, I had stumbled into the blueprint for changing who got to sit at that long plastic table in the meeting room. The election section explained how owners could nominate themselves, how many signatures were required to appear on the ballot, and how slates of candidates could form as long as they followed basic rally rules. It even laid out how informational meetings could be held in community spaces as long as the association calendar was respected. They had carefully defined how power passed from one group of board members to another, expecting that only a handful of people would ever bother to read that far. Now that I had, a different kind of plan began to form. Retaliation, at least the kind that works, does not always look like a dramatic confrontation in a parking lot. Sometimes it looks like a stack of photocopies, a quiet conversation at a backyard barbecue, and a calendar date circled in red ink while the evening sun glows orange off the lake. The first person I approached was Mr. K, a neighbor a few doors down who had lived in the community since it was built. He had mentioned, in passing, that he was tired of how aggressive the board had become about minor infractions. I knew he had a calm temperament and a good reputation among the older residents. Instead of complaining about my truck, I talked to him about process. I summarized how the board had skipped a proper hearing, how the mailbox rule had been brushed aside, and how the newsletter hinted at enforcement without acknowledging that not everyone was being treated the same. I emphasized that this was about consistency, not getting away with anything. Then I mentioned the election section in the binder. I described how the rules allowed anyone to gather signatures and submit a candidate form, how ballots had to include all qualified nominees, and how the association's own rules required them to provide equal access to communication channels for candidate introductions. He listened carefully, considering. By the time we wrapped up, he had not promised anything, but he had taken a copy of the nomination section and the calendar page that showed the upcoming filing deadline. That was enough for me. Next came two younger families at the far end of the street. They had kids, busy schedules, and a similar frustration with the way rules were enforced. Their fences had been measured and remeasured over inches, while certain other projects seemed to slide right past scrutiny. When I showed them my binder and walked through the sequence of letters, fines, and the May 12 final notice, they recognized the pattern instantly. Within a week, I had identified 3 potential candidates. None of them wanted to join the board just to start fights. They wanted predictability, fairness, and a little more humility from the people who wrote violation letters. I explained that running as a slate did not have to be confrontational. It could simply mean telling the community that there was another option, one that prioritized clear communication and equal enforcement. We gathered one quiet evening at my kitchen table. The lake breeze coming through the open window carried the faint sound of distant laughter and clinking dishes from a cookout several yards away. On the table between us sat my binder of evidence, 3 copies of the election rules, and a blank nomination form printed straight from the association's website. I told them, in simple terms, that I was ready to push back. Not just for me, but for anyone tired of seeing the rules used as a weapon instead of a guide. We divided tasks. One neighbor volunteered to handle signatures, walking the street with a friendly explanation of what they were proposing. Another offered to draft short candidate summaries to submit according to the rally rules, keeping the language respectful but honest. I focused on compiling a short, factual account of my experience, not as a complaint, but as a case study in why consistent procedure mattered. The next morning, the sun came up bright over the water, turning the lake into a field of glittering light. While birds chattered in the trees, I took one more step. I wrote a formal letter to the board, citing Parking Rule 5.2, CCR Section 4.3, and referencing the dates of each notice I had received. I requested a proper hearing and asked that all enforcement actions be paused until they could demonstrate that they had followed their own rules. I did not threaten. I did not raise my voice in the letter. I simply laid out the facts in the same structured way they like to use against owners, and I copied myself on the association's generic address for formal requests, per their documented procedure. What the board did not know yet was that the hearing I requested was only one part of the story. While they prepared to defend their actions on paper, a new slate of candidates was quietly forming, signatures were being gathered according to their own rally rules, and their comfortable positions on that long plastic table were about to be questioned for the first time in years. The next board meeting would not just be about a work truck and a lien threat. It would be about who got to hold the rulebook at all. Chapter 32:00. The board did not respond to my request right away. For almost 2 weeks, the only sounds on the street at night were the soft hiss of cars turning onto the cul-de-sac and the ripple of water against the docks. My truck stayed mostly in the driveway, more out of strategy than fear. I wanted their next move to be on paper, something I could slide into a sheet protector and add to my growing file. When the envelope finally arrived, it was labeled Notice of Hearing Opportunity. The letter acknowledged my request, gave me a date 2 weeks out, and explained that the board would consider the circumstances surrounding the parking violations. It said I would have 10 minutes to share relevant information, and that any decision would be communicated in writing afterward. The irony was not lost on me. After skipping the steps their own rules required, they were now scrambling to recreate the missing hearing once they realized I knew exactly what those rules said. The date they chose fell just before the nomination deadline for board candidates. That meant everything that happened in that small room could ripple straight into the election. I spent the nights leading up to the hearing fine-tuning my binder. I added tabs, notices, rules, timelines, comparisons. Under comparisons, I placed photos of other vehicles parked on the street overnight, the contractor van, the SUV, the boat trailer. For each, I noted dates and times. Under timelines, I created a simple chart showing when each notice arrived compared with what CCR Section 4.3 said about delivery and response windows. I was not trying to ambush them. I was preparing to show them, in their own language, that this was not about one truck. It was about process, power, and who got to bend the rules without consequences. On the day of the hearing, the association building's lobby smelled faintly of cleaning solution. Outside, the late afternoon sun flashed off parked cars, and heat shimmered above the asphalt. I walked into the small meeting room carrying my binder, feeling more like someone presenting a project than a defendant in trouble. 3 board members sat behind the same long plastic table. The president was in the center. To his left was the treasurer, a quiet man who rarely spoke in meetings. To his right, with arms crossed and a folder in front of her, sat Ms. D. Her expression was calm, but the tightness around her eyes told another story. Several neighbors had shown up and taken seats along the wall. Mr. K was there, along with the 2 younger families who had agreed to run as candidates. They did not fuss or whisper, they simply watched, taking in every detail. The president opened with a formal summary of the alleged violations. He described the photographs, referenced previous communications, and mentioned that the board took parking rules very seriously. When he finished, he gestured toward me and invited me to share my perspective. I laid my binder on the table, opened it to the Notices tab, and walked them through the sequence. I pointed out the courtesy slip, then the first violation letter, then the final notice dated May 12. I calmly highlighted the missing hearing step between the first letter and the threat of a lien, then flipped to Parking Rule 5.2 and read out the sentence about written notice, cure period, and hearing opportunity. I kept my voice steady. I did not accuse them of malice. I talked about process mismatches and missed steps. When I turned to CCR Section 4.3 and the mailbox rule, I showed how the dates on their letters and meetings did not provide the response time their own documents promised. Then I opened the comparisons section. I showed them photos of the contractor van, the SUV, and the boat trailer. I explained that I was not asking them to punish those owners. I was asking why my truck had generated 3 letters, fines, and a lien threat while similar situations went unaddressed. As I spoke, I noticed the treasurer frowning at the dates. The president kept his expression neutral, but he shifted in his chair whenever I referenced a specific CCR section. Ms. D, on the other hand, leaned forward, ready to jump in. When she finally did, she argued that my truck looked more commercial, that it was more noticeable, that it was her understanding that multiple courtesy notices had been left. I responded by pointing to the actual paper trail. My binder, unlike her memory, had timestamps and signatures. There was a moment, right then, when I realized what was really at stake. If the board chose to ignore their own contradictions in front of witnesses, they were not just mishandling a parking dispute. They were creating a record that they knowingly bent their own CCRs. And once that record existed, it could be used to challenge decisions, policies, and even who was fit to serve on the board at all. If they backed down, they would have to admit they acted too quickly. If they doubled down, they would walk straight into a legal consequence they had never planned for, losing the trust and support that kept them in power. When my 10 minutes were up, I closed the binder and stepped back. The president thanked me, said the board would deliberate, and asked everyone to step out so they could talk privately. The neighbors rose from their chairs, the scrape of metal legs on tile filling the brief silence before we filed into the hallway. Out there, in the cooler air near the front door, no one spoke loudly. A few murmured that the dates seemed off, that the rules did not say what the board had implied in their letters. The younger families exchanged looks that said more than any speech could. They had just watched a small, controlled system wobble when confronted with its own paperwork. When the board called me back in alone, the mood had shifted. The president told me, in measured terms, that the board had decided to waive the existing fines, as a gesture of goodwill and in recognition of some miscommunications. However, he insisted that parking rules still applied and that future violations could be subject to enforcement. I thanked them for waiving the fines, but inside, I did not mistake this for a win. It was a retreat, not a change of heart. They were trying to patch a leak in a wall that was already cracking. The lien threat might be off the table for now, but the mindset that created it was still very much in place. So I walked out of that hearing with a binder full of evidence, neighbors who had seen the gaps in the story, and one more powerful argument for why our slate needed to win the upcoming election. Election season in a homeowners association is not glamorous. There are no televised debates, no glossy billboards, no crowds chanting slogans. On our lakefront street, it looked more like neighbors talking on driveways at dusk, short summary sheets tucked into mailboxes, and quiet meetings at kitchen tables while the hum of air conditioning filled the background. Our slate of candidates kept the message simple. We focused on transparency, consistent enforcement, and respectful communication. We did not promise to abolish all rules or let the neighborhood fall apart. We promised to treat everyone the same under the rules that already existed and to fix vague or confusing sections that invited abuses of power. My story became an example, not a pity play. When we spoke to residents, I summarized what had happened with my truck and the lien threat, the late-night photos, the May 12th final notice, the missing hearing, the mailbox rule dates, and the way fines had been waived only after the board realized everything was documented. I did not dramatize. I just laid out the facts and asked a simple question in different words each time. If this could happen over a truck, what might happen over your fence, your paint color, or your guest parking? We respected the association's rally rules. We scheduled one official information night in the community room with proper reservations, invited all owners, and even invited existing board members to attend if they wanted. We distributed short candidate bios, each emphasizing calm leadership and fair procedure. Ms. D did not sit quietly through all this. Word filtered back that she was telling anyone who would listen that the board was under attack by people who did not respect the covenants. She framed our slate as troublemakers who wanted to weaken the association. But the more she repeated that line, the more people remembered the hearing and how quickly fines vanished when questioned. On the night of the election, the sky over the lake turned deep blue as the sun disappeared. Porch lights flicked on one by one. Inside the association room, the fluorescent lights hummed, and a plastic table was set up just as before, this time covered in manila envelopes containing ballots. Owners signed in, picked up their ballots, and stepped aside to mark their choices. There were a few quiet nods, some brief small talk about the weather, the upcoming holiday, the state of the docks. Underneath it all, there was a tension I could feel, a sense that something routine was about to go off script. When the voting period ended, the ballots were collected and counted right there, where everyone could see. The treasurer read out totals for each candidate, writing them on a whiteboard. Our slate did not sweep every seat, but we did not need to. We won a majority. Mr. K took one seat, one of the younger parents took another, and one existing board member who had always seemed uncomfortable with aggressive enforcement managed to hold his spot. The president lost his seat to a quiet, detail-oriented neighbor from the next street over. Ms. D's name stayed on the whiteboard with a lower tally than she had expected. She lost her position. There was no shouting. No one cheered. The loudest sound in the room was the shuffle of ballot envelopes being stacked and the soft click of dry erase markers being set down. In that quiet moment, I understood the real impact. The same person who had once stood in the dark, photographing my truck for late-night violations, no longer had an official role to threaten fines, push lien warnings, or shape policies from the inside. And with a new majority in place, the question was no longer whether I could escape a single lien. It was how far we could push the association back toward fairness before the old habits tried to reassert themselves. The new board's first formal meeting felt different from the moment it started. There was a printed agenda, as always, but this time there was also a printed copy of the Enforcement Procedures, CCR Section 4.3, and Parking Rule 5.2 placed in front of each member. The new president, now that quiet neighbor from the next street over, opened the meeting with a short statement about wanting a reset. Under new business, they scheduled a full review of enforcement practices. My case was brought up, not as a lingering problem, but as an example of how timelines and hearings had to be handled properly moving forward. The board voted to formalize a policy. Any violation that could lead to fines or liens would now require a clearly documented notice, a cure period matching CCR Section 4.3, and a scheduled hearing date shared in writing. They also discussed clarifying how work vehicles were defined. The new language, still a draft at that point, focused less on vague impressions and more on actual impact, size, condition, noise, and duration of street parking. It recognized that people in the community made their living with trucks, vans, and tools, and that the goal was not to shame anyone out of their profession. When it came time to address past actions, the board reviewed a list of accounts that had received aggressive notices in the last year. Several fines were reduced or waived when timeline errors or missing hearing notices were found. Owners who had quietly paid under pressure received letters acknowledging the mistakes and offering credits to future dues. I watched all of this as one owner among many. My binder sat on my lap, now more symbol than shield. It was still important, still real, but increasingly it served as a reminder of how fragile fairness had been before a few people decided to read the rules as carefully as the board did. Somewhere along the way, what had begun as a personal headache had turned into something larger, a small-scale HOA revenge story where the payoff was not a dramatic collapse, but a slow, steady shift in who got to make the rules. Time passed. The seasons turned over, and the lake changed from bright blue to steel gray and back again. Summer brought more boats, more grill smoke drifting over the water in the evenings, and the soft clatter of dishes on patios. Winter brought quiet mornings, frost on windshields, and the occasional mist rising off the surface like breath. My truck remained part of the neighborhood's daily rhythm. Some nights it stayed in the driveway. Some nights, when the boat needed the pad or when I returned late from a job and was too tired to back it in precisely, it rested at the curb in front of my own lawn. Each time I parked it there, I did it with a different awareness. I knew the rules now. I knew how long it could stay. I knew that if anyone had concerns, there was a clear process, a defined timeline, and a board that had to follow its own documents. The board meetings shifted too. Instead of feeling like interrogations, they started to feel more like check-ins. Owners came with questions and left with actual answers. Enforcement reports still existed, but they were shorter, more precise, and applied to real issues instead of personal pet peeves. Ms. D did not move away. She stayed in her beige two-story near the bend of the street. For a while, she seemed to walk around with a leftover sense of authority, correcting people informally and hinting at how things used to be handled. But without a seat at the table or an official title, her influence shrank. People still listened when she talked, but they weighed her words against their own experiences and the new board's track record. The idea that one person could turn a truck, a fence, or a mailbox into a weapon faded slowly, like the echo of a storm that had already passed. Every so often, I would catch her staring at my truck from her window. There was no phone in her hand anymore, no late-night flashes reflecting off the paint. Just a look that mixed annoyance with resignation, like someone trying to adjust to a street that no longer bent to their will. I will not pretend there were no costs. There were late nights reading dry paragraphs of CCRs, hours spent drafting letters, and a long stretch of time when my stomach tightened every time I opened the mailbox. There were neighbors who stayed neutral, owners who whispered that it would have been easier to just pay the fine and move on. But then I would see the treasurer double-checking dates on notices, or hear the new president remind the board about CCR Section 4.3 before voting on enforcement, or listen to a new homeowner being calmly walked through their first minor issue instead of being threatened with a lien. Those small changes added up. They turned an ugly chapter into something else, a signal that power in a community is not fixed, it shifts to whoever cares enough to show up, read the documents, and insist that they apply to everyone equally. Looking back, the most satisfying revenge was not seeing Ms. D lose her title. It was knowing that the next person targeted by an overzealous rule would not have to stand alone, terrified of a mysterious board behind a closed door. They would have a paper trail, a precedent, and a group of neighbors who had already walked that path and come out the other side with their homes, dignity, and autonomy intact. Tell me your worst HOA versus work truck nightmare in one line.